Hello, dear listeners, and welcome to another thoughtful episode here on the English Globe, a place where we explore important world topics through calm discussion and clear English, so that learners from all backgrounds can improve their listening skills, while also gaining a better understanding of how our globalized world works, because language learning becomes much more meaningful when it is connected to real events and real conversations happening across the world.
That's absolutely right, Adam. And today's topic is especially helpful for English learners who want to understand international news without feeling confused or overwhelmed, because we are not here to persuade anyone or take sides, but instead to explain ideas, vocabulary, and global relationships in a clear and educational way, so listeners can slowly build confidence when listening to serious topics discussed in English.
Today, Julia and I will focus on a very important question that often appears in global discussions, news headlines, and international analysis, which is the relationship between the United States and Venezuela, and more specifically, why the United States pays attention to Venezuela at all, since many learners naturally ask why countries that are far apart geographically still have strong interests in each other.
And before we go deeper, it is helpful for English learners to remember that understanding global context means understanding location, history, and basic international connections, because news stories rarely exist in isolation. And when we understand where a country is located and why it matters globally, the language used in international news becomes much easier to follow and much less intimidating.
Let's begin with geography, because geography often shapes global importance more than people realize, and Venezuela is located in the northern part of South America, with a long coastline along the Caribbean Sea, placing it close to major shipping routes that connect North America, Central America, and South America, which naturally increases its visibility and relevance in international trade and regional discussions.
For English learners, this is a good moment to notice how location is often explained using descriptive language, such as borders, coastlines, and neighboring countries. Because Venezuela shares borders with Colombia, Brazil, and Guyana. And these geographic connections help explain why regional stability, trade movement, and cooperation in Latin America are often discussed together rather than separately.
Now, when we talk about the United States, it is important to understand that it has long paid attention to Latin America as a region, not because of one single reason, but because of historical ties, economic relationships, cultural connections, and geographic closeness, since many Latin American countries are located relatively near U.S. borders, making regional developments naturally more relevant to American policymakers and businesses.
This is where English learners can benefit by learning broader terms like region, influence, and international interest, because the United States often views Latin America as part of its wider neighborhood, meaning that changes in one country can sometimes affect trade, migration patterns, and economic cooperation across the region, which is why Venezuela frequently appears in international discussions.
Another important factor that shapes global interest is natural resources, and Venezuela is widely known for having large energy resources, which places it into global conversations about energy supply, economic development, and international markets. And while we will explore these ideas more carefully later, it is enough for now to understand that countries with valuable resources often receive more global attention.
From a language learning perspective, this helps listeners understand why words like resources, markets, exports, and global demand are so common in international news, because these terms are used to describe how countries interact economically, and learning them in context helps English learners move beyond basic vocabulary into more advanced listening comprehension.
History also plays a strong role in shaping how countries see each other, because past relationships, agreements, and disagreements often influence present-day conversations, and the history of relations between the United States and countries in Latin America has evolved over many decades, shaped by changing global systems, economic priorities, and regional developments.
This is a very important idea for learners because news articles and podcasts often refer to historical background without explaining it fully. And when listeners understand that history provides context rather than judgment, they can focus more on understanding the language itself instead of feeling confused by unfamiliar references or complex sentence structures.
When we combine geography, resources, and history, we begin to see why Venezuela appears regularly in international discussions involving the United States, not as a simple story, but as part of a larger global system where countries are connected through trade, location, and long-term relationships that influence decision-making on many different levels.
And for English learners, this section shows how calm, descriptive language can be used to explain complex topics without emotional or persuasive wording, which is especially useful for those who want to practice listening to longer sentences, formal explanations, and balanced discussions that reflect how global issues are often presented in educational media.
Before we continue exploring this topic further, we would like to invite our listeners to support the English Globe by liking this episode, subscribing to the channel, and sharing your thoughts in the comments, because your engagement helps us continue creating long-form educational content designed specifically for learners who want to grow through listening, patience, and consistent practice.
Yes, and we truly encourage you to share your thoughts, not as political opinions, but as reflections on how learning English through global topics has helped you improve your understanding and confidence, because this podcast is about education, awareness, and steady progress. And every listener who joins this journey becomes part of a growing global learning community.
To understand why Venezuela often appears in global economic discussions, it is important to begin with a simple and clear explanation of what natural resources are, because this term is widely used in international news and academic conversations, yet many English learners hear it frequently without fully understanding its meaning or its importance in shaping relationships between countries.
That is a very good starting point, Adam, because natural resources are materials that come from the earth and are used by people to support daily life and economic activity such as oil, gas, water, minerals, and agricultural land. And when learners understand this basic definition, they can more easily follow conversations about global trade, development, and international cooperation.
Natural resources become especially important when they are used to produce energy, since energy is needed to power factories, transport goods, heat homes, and support modern technology, which means that countries with large energy resources often play a noticeable role in the global economy, not because of politics, but because energy demand connects nearly every country in the world.
For English learners, this is a good moment to notice how cause and effect language is used, because when a country has large energy resources, it often leads to increased production, exports, and international partnerships. And words like because, as a result, and therefore are commonly used to explain these connections in formal English.
Venezuela is widely known for having significant oil resources, and oil is one of the most important energy sources in the global economy, because it is used not only for fuel in cars and airplanes, but also for producing electricity, manufacturing goods, and supporting industries that depend on stable energy supplies to function smoothly.
This helps learners understand why oil is often described as a strategic resource in international discussions, since many countries depend on imported energy to meet their needs. And when oil production or exports change in one part of the world, the effects can sometimes be felt across global markets, influencing prices and economic planning.
When countries produce more energy than they consume, they often export these resources to other countries, and exports play an important role in national economies, because they bring income, support jobs, and help countries participate in global trade systems, which are built on long-term agreements and shared economic interests rather than short-term decisions.
From a language learning perspective, words like production, exports, and global markets appear very frequently in news reports, and hearing them used repeatedly in clear explanations helps learners become more comfortable with formal vocabulary that is necessary for understanding documentaries, podcasts, and international articles.
It is also important to understand that energy dependence varies from country to country, because some nations have abundant natural resources, while others rely heavily on imports. And this difference naturally shapes how countries plan their economies, manage their budgets, and build relationships with energy-producing regions around the world.
This idea is very useful for learners because it shows how one factor can influence many outcomes, and when listening to English content, recognizing these cause and effect patterns makes long explanations easier to follow, especially when speakers connect ideas logically rather than emotionally.
Venezuela's natural resources have therefore placed it into global energy discussions over many years, not as an isolated case, but as part of a wider system where supply, demand, transportation, and economic planning are closely connected, and understanding this system helps explain why energy-producing countries often receive consistent international attention.
For learners, this demonstrates how neutral and descriptive language can explain complex global topics without judgment, and it also provides repeated exposure to useful academic words that are essential for building confidence in listening to serious English content.
Another important point is that managing natural resources requires infrastructure, technology, and long-term planning, because resources alone do not automatically create economic success. And this is why discussions about energy often include topics like investment, maintenance, and international cooperation, which are explained through formal sentence structures.
This is where learners can observe how formal English uses longer sentences to connect ideas clearly, allowing speakers to explain not only what something is, but also why it matters and how it affects other parts of the global system, which is exactly the kind of listening practice that helps improve comprehension over time.
By understanding what natural resources are, why oil is important, and how countries depend on energy for economic stability, listeners can better understand global discussions without feeling lost, because these basic concepts form the foundation for many international stories, reports, and educational conversations.
And to summarize for our English learners, key words to remember from this section include natural resources, energy, production, exports, and global economy, because these terms will appear again and again in international English content, and recognizing them quickly will make listening feel much easier and more rewarding.
As we continue exploring this topic, our goal remains the same, which is to help you build strong listening skills through calm explanations and clear vocabulary, so that over time you can understand complex global topics in English with patience, confidence, and steady progress.
Yes, and remember that improving English is not about speed, but about consistency and understanding. And by listening to long-form discussions like this one, you are training your ears and your mind to follow real-world English used in thoughtful and educational contexts.
When we talk about oil in a global context, it is helpful to think of it not as a political tool, but as an economic product that is traded internationally through well-established systems, because oil is bought and sold every day by countries, companies, and industries that depend on stable energy supplies to keep transportation, manufacturing, and daily economic activities functioning smoothly.
This perspective is especially useful for English learners because economic topics are often explained using formal and neutral language. And when learners understand that oil is discussed mainly as a commodity in global markets, they can focus more on understanding vocabulary and sentence structure rather than feeling distracted by opinions or emotional language.
Oil is traded internationally through contracts, shipping routes, and energy exchanges, and in many cases, prices are influenced by supply and demand rather than by individual decisions, meaning that when oil production increases in several regions, prices are often adjusted accordingly, while reduced supply can lead to higher prices across global markets.
For learners, this is a clear example of how the passive voice is used in economic explanations, because phrases like prices are influenced, oil is traded, and supply is reduced are common in news reports, and recognizing these structures makes it much easier to follow long explanations in spoken English.
Global energy markets are connected systems, which means that oil produced in one part of the world can be refined, transported, and consumed in another region. And this interconnected process helps explain why energy markets affect not only fuel prices, but also the cost of transportation, food production, and manufactured goods worldwide.
This connection gives English learners an opportunity to practice economic vocabulary such as markets, consumption, distribution, and global demand, because these words appear repeatedly when economists and analysts explain how energy prices influence everyday life in many different countries.
One important feature of global energy markets is price sensitivity, because oil prices respond quickly to changes in supply levels, transportation conditions, and overall demand, and as a result, even small disruptions can sometimes lead to noticeable changes in prices that are felt by consumers and businesses around the world.
From a language learning point of view, this shows how cause and effect relationships are described in formal English, using long sentences that connect ideas carefully, allowing learners to follow the logic step by step, instead of trying to understand isolated words without context.
Stability plays a crucial role in energy supply, because predictable production and reliable transportation systems help markets function smoothly. And when stability is maintained, long-term planning becomes possible for industries, governments, and consumers who rely on consistent energy availability.
This is where learners can observe how abstract concepts like stability and reliability are discussed in economic English, often using calm and measured language that avoids strong emotion, which is typical of educational and analytical discussions.
When energy supply is stable, investments can be planned more effectively, infrastructure can be maintained properly, and international trade can continue without major interruptions, which helps explain why stability is frequently mentioned in discussions about global energy markets, without attaching political meaning to the term.
For English learners, understanding this vocabulary helps build confidence when listening to business news or economic podcasts, because these topics often rely on the same core ideas and phrases that appear repeatedly in global discussions.
It is also important to understand that oil markets are influenced by long-term trends such as technological development, energy efficiency, and diversification of energy sources, meaning that oil remains important, but it is part of a broader energy system that continues to evolve over time.
This introduces learners to another useful idea in economic English, which is comparison and contrast, because speakers often explain how traditional energy sources and new alternatives coexist, using descriptive language rather than persuasive arguments.
By viewing oil as an economic connector rather than a political instrument, learners can better understand why countries remain linked through trade relationships, shared markets, and mutual economic interests, even when their political systems or priorities may differ.
And for those learning English, this approach shows how serious topics can be discussed calmly and professionally, using structured sentences that explain systems and processes rather than focusing on conflict or opinion.
As listeners become more familiar with how oil markets operate, they begin to recognize recurring patterns in economic discussions, such as supply chains, price adjustments, and market responses, which are explained using consistent vocabulary and formal sentence structures.
To help learners talk about economics in English, it is useful to practice phrases like is influenced by, is connected to, and plays a role in, because these expressions are commonly used in educational content and help speakers sound clear and confident when explaining complex ideas.
Our goal with this section is to help you understand the language of global energy markets in a simple and accessible way, so that when you encounter similar topics in English media, you can focus on comprehension and learning rather than feeling uncertain or overwhelmed.
Exactly. And by listening to long explanations like this, you are training yourself to follow formal English used in real-world contexts, which is one of the most effective ways to improve listening skills, expand vocabulary, and gain confidence in understanding global economic discussions.
When we use the term foreign policy in an educational context, it simply refers to the general approach a country uses to manage its relationships with other countries through communication, agreements, trade arrangements, and long-term planning, because no nation exists in isolation. And foreign policy is the framework that helps governments decide how to interact with the wider world in a structured, predictable, and organized way, rather than through sudden or emotional reactions.
For English learners, understanding this definition is extremely helpful, because foreign policy is an abstract concept that appears frequently in news articles, documentaries, and academic discussions. And when learners recognize that it describes a system of decisions and priorities rather than personal opinions, they can listen more calmly and focus on the language being used instead of feeling confused by complex or unfamiliar terminology.
Countries interact with one another for many practical reasons, including economic cooperation, regional stability, access to markets, cultural exchange, and shared global responsibilities. And these interactions are guided by foreign policy strategies that are developed over time, influenced by geography, economic needs, historical relationships, and international rules that help reduce uncertainty and encourage cooperation between different nations.
From a language learning perspective, this explanation shows how formal English often relies on abstract nouns such as cooperation, stability, influence, and responsibility. And when learners become familiar with these words, they find it easier to understand long academic sentences, because these nouns allow speakers to discuss complex ideas without focusing on individual actions or dramatic events.
One of the most common goals of foreign policy is stability, which means creating conditions where relationships between countries remain predictable and manageable. Since stability supports economic planning, long-term investment, and international cooperation, and without a certain level of stability, trade systems, diplomatic communication, and global problem-solving efforts become more difficult to maintain effectively.
This idea helps English learners improve comprehension, because stability is often explained using cause and effect language and sentence connectors, like therefore, as a result. And because of this, and recognizing these patterns allows listeners to follow extended explanations more easily, especially when speakers are discussing policies rather than concrete events.
Trade is another key element of foreign policy, because countries rely on the exchange of goods, services, and resources to support their economies, and foreign policy helps establish the rules and agreements that make international trade possible, ensuring that markets function smoothly, contracts are respected, and economic relationships remain beneficial over long periods of time.
For learners, trade-related discussions provide excellent academic listening practice, since they include formal expressions such as economic partnership, market access, and long-term cooperation. And repeated exposure to this vocabulary helps listeners understand how global economic systems are described in professional English without needing advanced political knowledge.
Diplomacy also plays a central role in foreign policy, as it refers to communication between governments through dialogue, negotiation, and official representation. And diplomacy is used to manage differences, prevent misunderstandings, and promote cooperation, making it a practical tool that supports peaceful interaction rather than conflict or confrontation.
When English learners understand the meaning of diplomacy, they become better prepared to follow international discussions, because this word often appears alongside others like negotiation, agreement, and dialogue. And recognizing these related terms allows listeners to build a mental map of how countries communicate and resolve issues through structured and formal processes.
It is important to remember that foreign policy is not fixed or permanent, but instead evolves as global conditions change, since economic trends, technological development, and international challenges influence how countries define their priorities, which is why foreign policy is best understood as a long-term framework rather than a set of short-term decisions.
For English learners, this understanding improves overall listening confidence because it shows that policy discussions are usually focused on systems and goals instead of personal beliefs. And when learners approach these topics with a language learning mindset, they can concentrate on vocabulary, sentence structure, and meaning rather than feeling pressured to form opinions.
By viewing foreign policy as a neutral concept that explains how countries organize their external relationships, listeners can better understand international news and academic content, because many global topics are built upon this foundation, and recognizing it helps learners connect ideas logically across long explanations.
And from an educational perspective, learning policy-related vocabulary strengthens comprehension skills, because these abstract terms appear repeatedly in serious English content, and the more familiar learners become with them, the easier it becomes to follow long-form podcasts, lectures, and discussions that explain global issues calmly and clearly.
When we talk about political systems in an educational way, we are referring to the different methods countries use to organize their governments, make decisions, and manage public responsibilities, because around the world, there are various systems such as democracies, republics, monarchies, and other forms of governance. And understanding these systems does not require agreement or criticism, but simply awareness of how countries structure authority and administration.
For English learners, this explanation is important because political systems are often mentioned in international news using formal vocabulary. And when learners understand that these systems describe organization rather than opinion, they can listen more confidently and focus on learning words like government, authority, institutions, and leadership, without feeling overwhelmed by complex discussions.
Different political systems exist because countries have different histories, cultures, and social structures, and over time these factors influence how laws are created, how leaders are chosen, and how public decisions are made, which is why no single system is used everywhere, and why global discussions often describe systems rather than compare them.
This idea helps learners see how neutral language is used to explain differences, because instead of saying one system is better or worse, educational English often focuses on description, using phrases such as is based on, is organized around, or is structured to, which makes explanations clearer and less emotional.
International relations describe how governments communicate and interact with one another across borders, and this interaction usually takes place through official channels such as embassies, international organizations, meetings, and agreements, allowing countries to exchange information, manage shared concerns, and maintain organized communication even when their political systems are different.
For learners, this is a good opportunity to notice how formal English explains processes, because terms like international relations, bilateral communication, and multilateral cooperation are often used to describe structured interaction rather than personal conversation, helping listeners understand how governments operate at a global level.
Diplomacy plays a central role in international relations, as it refers to the practice of managing relationships through dialogue and negotiation instead of conflict, and it allows governments to express concerns, propose solutions, and work toward shared goals in a way that supports stability and long-term cooperation.
When English learners understand the word diplomacy, they begin to recognize it as a key concept in global discussions, because it often appears alongside words like dialogue, agreement, cooperation, and negotiation. And learning these terms together helps listeners build a clearer picture of how international communication works.
One reason diplomacy is important is that it creates predictable systems for communication, which helps reduce misunderstanding between countries with different political traditions, languages, and priorities, and by using established diplomatic methods, governments can manage differences while continuing economic, cultural, and educational exchanges.
From a learning perspective, this shows how abstract ideas are explained through logical sentence structure, because long sentences are often used to connect causes and outcomes, allowing learners to practice listening to formal explanations that are common in academic podcasts and international reports.
Political systems and diplomacy are often discussed together because the way a government is organized can influence how it communicates internationally. Yet despite these differences, shared rules and international norms allow countries to cooperate on trade, security, and global challenges without requiring identical political structures.
This helps English learners understand that international relations focus on cooperation rather than comparison. And when learners recognize this neutral approach, they can better understand news content without assuming that discussions are meant to persuade or judge.
By learning basic political vocabulary in a factual and calm way, listeners can improve their ability to follow serious English content, because these terms appear frequently in documentaries, podcasts, and articles that explain how the world functions at a structural level rather than through individual opinions.
And for learners, restating these ideas in simple English helps build confidence, because when complex systems are broken down into clear explanations, listening becomes less stressful and more rewarding, allowing steady progress in understanding long-form English discussions about global topics.
When international news discusses sanctions and diplomacy, it is important to understand these terms as general tools used in global relations, rather than as statements of approval or criticism, because in an educational context, sanctions simply refer to economic or administrative measures that are applied by one country or a group of countries in response to certain situations, and they are usually designed to influence behavior through non-military means within established international systems.
For English learners, this explanation is very helpful because the word sanctions often appears in headlines without much detail. And when learners understand that sanctions are tools rather than emotional reactions, they can listen more calmly and focus on learning how formal English explains complex international actions using careful and neutral language.
Diplomacy, on the other hand, refers to communication and negotiation between governments, and it is usually conducted through official representatives, international meetings, and formal agreements, allowing countries to express concerns, manage disagreements, and explore cooperation without direct confrontation, which is why diplomacy is considered a foundational element of international relations.
From a language learning point of view, diplomacy is an important word to recognize because it is often connected with formal verbs such as negotiate, coordinate, and communicate. And hearing these words used repeatedly in structured explanations helps learners become more comfortable with the language used in international news reports.
Countries use economic tools like sanctions, trade restrictions, or incentives because these methods allow governments to respond to international situations without using force. And if economic pressure is applied carefully, it can encourage dialogue or adjustment while still operating within international legal frameworks that aim to reduce conflict and promote stability.
This is where English learners can notice conditional sentence structures, because explanations often include phrases such as, if measures are applied, then outcomes may change, or if cooperation increases, stability can be supported, and recognizing these patterns makes long explanations easier to follow.
International rules play an important role in guiding how these tools are used, because organizations, treaties, and agreements exist to define acceptable behavior and outline procedures for resolving disputes, and these rules help ensure that actions are taken within agreed frameworks rather than through unpredictable or unilateral decisions.
For learners listening to global news, words like framework, agreement, regulation, and compliance are extremely useful because they appear frequently when international systems are explained. And understanding them allows listeners to grasp the structure behind complex global interactions.
Sanctions are often discussed alongside diplomacy because they are sometimes used together, meaning that while economic measures may be applied, diplomatic communication often continues, allowing space for discussion, negotiation, and adjustment over time within international institutions.
This combination of tools shows learners how formal English balances ideas carefully, because speakers often avoid absolute statements and instead use measured language that explains processes, possibilities, and outcomes, rather than making direct predictions or strong claims.
Another important point is that economic tools are not used in isolation, because their effects depend on global cooperation, market response, and international participation, and without shared understanding and coordination, such tools may produce limited or unintended results.
For English learners, this highlights why listening for complex ideas is important, because long sentences often connect multiple factors such as cooperation, response, and outcome. And training the ear to follow these connections improves overall comprehension.
When international rules function effectively, they create predictability, which allows countries, businesses, and organizations to plan decisions more carefully. And this predictability supports global trade, financial stability, and long-term cooperation across different regions of the world.
This is a good example of how abstract nouns are used in academic English, because words like predictability, stability, coordination, and cooperation allow speakers to explain systems without focusing on individuals, making explanations sound professional and balanced.
It is also important to understand that discussions about sanctions and diplomacy often evolve over time, because global conditions change, economic circumstances shift, and diplomatic channels adapt, which is why these topics are usually presented as ongoing processes rather than fixed outcomes.
For learners, recognizing this process-based language is very useful, because phrases like over time, in response to, and within this context appear frequently in international analysis, and understanding them helps listeners follow long-form discussions more confidently.
By explaining sanctions, diplomacy, and international tools step by step, the goal is not to encourage agreement or disagreement, but to help listeners understand the vocabulary and structures used in serious English content, so that global news becomes easier to understand and less intimidating.
And to highlight some useful words for news listening, learners should pay attention to terms such as sanctions, diplomacy, economic measures, international frameworks, and negotiation, because these words appear repeatedly in global reporting, and understanding them can greatly improve listening comprehension.
Through consistent exposure to neutral explanations like this, listeners can gradually build the skills needed to follow complex international discussions in English, focusing on language development rather than opinion, and developing confidence through patience and practice.
Exactly, and by listening carefully to long, structured explanations, English learners strengthen their ability to understand formal spoken English, which is essential for engaging with documentaries, podcasts, and global news in a calm and informed way.
When the word power is used in international discussions, it is often misunderstood as something aggressive or forceful, but in an academic and educational context, power usually refers to influence, which means the ability of a country to shape outcomes, guide cooperation, or affect decisions through economic strength, diplomatic relationships, cultural presence, and long-term engagement rather than through direct pressure or confrontation.
For English learners, this distinction is very important, because the word power appears frequently in news reports and global analysis, and understanding that it often describes influence rather than force helps listeners interpret sentences more accurately and focus on the meaning of abstract vocabulary instead of imagining conflict or tension where none is being described.
One common type of influence is economic power, which comes from a country's ability to participate actively in global trade, investment, and production systems, because when a nation is deeply connected to international markets, its decisions can affect supply chains, prices, and economic planning in other parts of the world through cooperation rather than direct control.
This explanation gives English learners useful economic language because words like markets, investment, production, and trade appear together very often, and hearing them used calmly in long sentences helps learners understand how economic influence is explained logically in professional English.
Diplomatic power is another form of influence, and it refers to a country's ability to communicate effectively, build partnerships, and participate in international organizations, because diplomacy allows governments to exchange ideas, manage disagreements, and work toward shared goals through dialogue and negotiation instead of conflict.
For learners, diplomacy-related vocabulary is especially valuable because terms like dialogue, cooperation, agreement, and negotiation are commonly used in formal English. And recognizing these words makes it easier to follow discussions about international meetings and global cooperation.
Cultural influence also plays an important role in world affairs, because language, education, media, and shared values can shape how countries are perceived and understood. And when cultural exchange takes place through education, travel, and communication, it often builds familiarity and trust over time without the need for formal agreements.
This is a helpful idea for English learners because culture-related influence shows how language itself can be a form of connection, and learning English allows people to access global conversations, educational content, and professional opportunities that are part of international cultural exchange.
Influence works internationally through networks rather than commands, meaning that countries interact within systems of cooperation, shared interests, and mutual benefit. And when influence is exercised effectively, it often appears subtle, gradual, and based on long-term relationships rather than immediate results.
For learners practicing listening skills, this kind of explanation demonstrates balanced sentence structures, where ideas are connected carefully, using phrases like rather than, because, and over time, helping listeners follow complex reasoning without feeling lost.
Cooperation matters in world affairs because global challenges such as economic stability, energy supply, environmental concerns, and public health cannot be managed by one country alone, and influence becomes most effective when countries work together through shared frameworks and coordinated efforts.
This helps English learners understand why words like cooperation, coordination, and partnership appear so frequently in global discussions, because these abstract nouns allow speakers to describe collective action without focusing on individual countries or leaders.
It is also important to recognize that influence is often shaped by consistency and reliability, because when a country is seen as predictable and committed to cooperation, its role in international systems becomes stronger over time through trust rather than authority.
For everyday English learning, this idea shows how abstract concepts are explained using logical progression, where one idea leads naturally to another, making it easier for learners to anticipate meaning even when sentences are long and vocabulary is advanced.
By understanding power as influence, listeners can better interpret international discussions without assuming negative intentions, because most academic explanations focus on how countries interact within systems rather than how they compete through force.
This perspective is very useful for learners who want to improve comprehension, because it encourages listening for structure and meaning rather than reacting emotionally to certain words that may sound strong but are used neutrally in educational contexts.
In global affairs, influence grows through communication, economic participation, cultural presence, and cooperation, and when these elements are combined thoughtfully, they create lasting connections that support stability and shared progress rather than confrontation.
And for English learners, listening to explanations like this builds confidence in understanding abstract vocabulary, balanced arguments, and long logical sentences, which are essential skills for following podcasts, lectures, and serious discussions in English.
Our aim in this section is to help you recognize how the language of influence is used calmly and academically, so that when you encounter similar discussions in English media, you can focus on comprehension, vocabulary growth, and logical reasoning.
Exactly. And by practicing with long-form listening that explains global ideas step by step, you are strengthening your English in a meaningful way. Because understanding how influence works internationally also helps you understand how language itself connects people across the world.
When we talk about global events and international decisions, it is easy to think that these topics only affect governments, leaders, or large institutions, but in reality, many decisions made at the international level gradually influence the daily lives of ordinary people through changes in prices, employment opportunities, availability of goods, and the overall economic environment in which people live and work.
For English learners, this connection is very important to understand because it shows that global news is not separate from everyday life. And when learners recognize how international decisions are linked to familiar experiences like shopping, working, or traveling, listening to long explanations becomes more meaningful and easier to follow.
One clear example of how global events affect daily life can be seen in prices, because when international markets change, the cost of energy, transportation, and imported goods can also change. And these shifts often influence how much people pay for basic items such as food, fuel, and household products over time.
From a language learning perspective, this is a useful moment to notice cause and effect explanations, because speakers often use phrases like "as a result." This leads to, or because of these changes, and understanding these connectors helps learners follow long sentences that explain why certain outcomes happen.
Jobs are another area where global connections can be felt, because international trade, investment, and cooperation influence which industries grow, which businesses expand, and which skills are needed in the workforce, meaning that decisions made far away can sometimes affect employment opportunities in local communities.
For learners, this shows how abstract global ideas connect to real-life vocabulary, because words like employment, industry, investment, and opportunity are commonly used to explain how international systems affect individual lives, and hearing them in context helps improve listening comprehension.
Global connections also affect how products move from one country to another, since many everyday items are produced in one place, transported through international supply chains, and sold in different markets, which means that changes in global conditions can influence availability and delivery times without people always noticing the reason immediately.
This is why patient listening is so important for English learners, because explanations about supply chains and global connections often require longer sentences to show how one step leads to another. And training yourself to stay focused during these explanations improves overall understanding.
Another important aspect is awareness, because when people have a basic understanding of how global events work, they are better prepared to understand changes in their environment, adapt to new conditions, and make informed decisions in their personal and professional lives without feeling confused or uncertain.
For learners, awareness also means recognizing familiar patterns in English explanations, such as problem and effect structures or examples followed by clarification, which makes long-form listening less stressful and more rewarding over time.
It is important to note that these global influences usually happen gradually rather than suddenly, meaning that changes in prices, jobs, or availability often develop over months or years. And understanding this gradual process helps listeners interpret global news calmly instead of expecting immediate or dramatic effects.
This gradual explanation style is very helpful for English learners because it reflects how real academic and news discussions are structured, using careful wording and measured pacing rather than short dramatic statements.
International decisions can also influence travel, education, and cultural exchange, because policies related to trade, cooperation, and communication often affect how easily people can move, study, or work across borders, connecting personal experiences to broader global systems.
For learners, this highlights how learning English itself is part of global connection, because language allows people to access education, professional opportunities, and information that crosses national boundaries, making global awareness directly useful for personal growth.
When global topics are explained in a calm and factual way, they help people feel more informed rather than overwhelmed. And this approach allows listeners to understand complex systems without feeling pressured to react emotionally or take positions they may not fully understand.
This is why listening patiently to long explanations is such a valuable skill for English learners, because real-world English often unfolds slowly, connecting ideas step by step, and practicing this kind of listening builds both comprehension and confidence.
By understanding how international events affect ordinary people through economic conditions, job markets, and daily expenses, listeners can see global discussions as practical explanations of interconnected systems rather than distant or abstract debates.
And for learners, this section is a reminder that improving English is not only about grammar or vocabulary, but also about learning how ideas are developed over time in spoken language, which is exactly what long educational podcasts help you practice.
Our goal here is to help you understand that global awareness and language learning go hand in hand, because when you can follow explanations about how the world works, you also strengthen your ability to listen, think, and respond in English with clarity.
Exactly. And by staying patient with long explanations like this one, you are training yourself to understand real-life English used in meaningful contexts, which will help you feel more confident when listening to news, discussions, and educational content in the future.
When we consider the value of world news for English learning, it becomes clear that following international events provides learners with a unique opportunity to expand vocabulary, understand complex sentence structures, and practice long-form listening, because news stories are often delivered in calm, structured language that connects multiple ideas, explains cause and effect relationships, and uses formal expressions that rarely appear in casual conversation, which means that listeners are exposed to academic and professional English in a context that is both practical and intellectually stimulating.
For learners, this is especially motivating because listening to news in English allows them to experience language as it is actually used to explain real-world situations. And when learners focus on identifying key terms, recurring expressions, and sentence patterns in news reports, they not only increase their vocabulary, but also improve their ability to follow arguments, comprehend long sentences, and notice subtle distinctions between different types of information without becoming confused or overwhelmed.
World events are particularly useful because they often involve repeated terminology, such as diplomacy, cooperation, stability, investment, influence, and economic measures. And hearing these words in different contexts helps learners understand how the same term can be applied to multiple situations, which strengthens both recognition and comprehension. And over time, learners also become familiar with the rhythm, pacing, and tone of formal English, allowing them to anticipate how ideas will develop in extended explanations.
This kind of exposure is also critical for developing listening stamina, because real-world English often involves sentences that are long, logically connected, and filled with subordinate clauses. And when learners practice following these extended sentences without interruption, they train their brains to maintain focus, integrate multiple pieces of information simultaneously, and understand nuanced meaning, which are essential skills for academic listening, professional communication, and effective comprehension in a global context.
Another important benefit of learning English through world news is that it combines vocabulary growth with critical thinking, because when listeners pay attention to how journalists and educators describe events, causes, and outcomes, they are exposed to precise language, formal connectors, and clear reasoning, all of which can be internalized gradually, allowing learners to replicate similar sentence structures in their own speaking and writing, while also developing the ability to follow multi-layered arguments without losing track of the main ideas.
For English learners, reflecting on this progress is essential because it reinforces the understanding that language acquisition is not only about memorizing words, but also about learning to process information in extended formats, noticing patterns, and becoming comfortable with the natural flow of formal English, which includes using connectors like therefore, consequently, as a result, and in addition, as well as understanding how subordinate clauses provide context, background, and reasoning throughout a news report.
News-based English also allows learners to encounter idiomatic and professional phrases in context, such as long-term cooperation, market fluctuations, policy frameworks, and international engagement. And understanding these phrases in repeated real-life contexts increases comprehension accuracy, because learners begin to associate words not only with abstract definitions, but with practical usage in explanatory or analytical discussions, which improves both receptive skills and confidence in listening to complex materials.
In addition, learning English through global news encourages learners to adopt long-form listening strategies, because following extended podcasts, documentaries, and news reports requires focus on paragraph-level meaning, logical sequencing, and transitions between ideas, which trains learners to anticipate patterns, retain key points, and connect multiple details into a coherent understanding, making it easier to understand professional English in academic or workplace settings where concise repetition and short phrases are rare.
It is also important to recognize that world news provides natural opportunities to practice pronunciation, intonation, and rhythm in English, because sentences are delivered with clear pacing, careful stress on important words, and logical breaks that help listeners internalize not only meaning, but also the natural flow of English. And over time, learners can improve their ability to reproduce long sentences accurately while maintaining coherence, which is a skill that contributes significantly to speaking and writing fluency.
Finally, learners who engage consistently with world news in English develop a sense of progress, because even when individual sentences are long and contain unfamiliar vocabulary, the cumulative effect of repeated exposure to structured language, formal connectors, and analytical phrasing gradually improves comprehension, builds confidence, and demonstrates that attentive, patient listening to serious topics is one of the most effective ways to achieve mastery in long-form English listening, vocabulary retention, and logical language processing.
By summarizing, world news serves as an ideal platform for English learners to practice all essential skills simultaneously, because it combines extended listening practice, advanced vocabulary, formal connectors, structured reasoning, and cause-and-effect explanations, allowing learners to approach complex topics with calm focus, gradually improving comprehension, sentence prediction, and the ability to understand nuanced professional and academic English without relying on simplified materials or constant repetition.
And for learners, this section should reinforce the idea that patience and consistency are key, because understanding global topics in English is not about immediate mastery, but about building long-term listening stamina, internalizing vocabulary through repeated exposure, and training the mind to follow multi-layered ideas, which makes it possible to gradually comprehend professional-level English while staying informed about the world in a way that is calm, educational, and rewarding.
As we reflect on everything we have discussed in this podcast, it is important to understand that listening to global news, international analysis, and discussions about power, influence, diplomacy, and economic relationships provides English learners with a unique and practical way to improve their language skills. Because when learners pay attention to how ideas are structured, how complex sentences are connected through formal connectors such as consequently, therefore, as a result, and in addition, and how abstract concepts like influence, stability, and cooperation are explained in context, they not only learn vocabulary, but also develop the ability to follow nuanced reasoning and articulate their own ideas clearly and logically in English, which is a skill that is directly transferable to academic, professional, and social contexts.
For English learners, this is particularly valuable because understanding vocabulary in isolation is not enough to gain fluency. It is equally important to notice how words are used in extended sentences, how examples illustrate abstract concepts, and how different ideas are linked together to form a coherent narrative, which is why listening to long-form podcasts about international topics trains the mind to process information in English more efficiently, recognize patterns in professional speech, and internalize the natural rhythm and pacing of complex explanations without losing focus or becoming overwhelmed by the length of the sentences.
One practical tip for learners is to actively take notes while listening, especially focusing on key terms, recurring phrases, and connectors that signal cause, contrast, or sequence, because writing down these words and their context reinforces memory, helps learners recognize sentence patterns, and provides material to review and practice later, ensuring that the language input is converted into active knowledge rather than passive exposure, which is essential when dealing with advanced English content that involves multiple interconnected ideas across different domains, such as economics, diplomacy, and global energy.
Another strategy is to pause and summarize after each segment or complex sentence, which allows learners to reinforce comprehension, practice forming their own sentences using new vocabulary, and build confidence in understanding long explanations, because summarizing requires processing information at a deeper level, connecting ideas logically, and producing language that mirrors the structure and tone of professional English, which is exactly the type of skill that helps learners succeed not only in listening comprehension, but also in speaking and writing when discussing real-world topics.
Learners should also focus on identifying cause and effect relationships, because international news often explains why certain events happen, what consequences follow, and how different countries respond to each other, and noticing phrases such as a result, this leads to, in response, and consequently provides a framework for following long arguments, understanding multi-layered explanations, and building critical thinking skills in English, all of which contribute to stronger comprehension, better retention of vocabulary, and more precise usage in speaking and writing contexts.
In addition, learners can benefit greatly from shadowing or repeating sentences after listening, because mimicking pronunciation, intonation, and sentence rhythm helps internalize the natural flow of English, reinforces memory of advanced vocabulary, and strengthens the ability to produce complex sentences spontaneously, which is particularly effective when listening to podcasts that use long descriptive sentences to explain global events, since learners are exposed to both language and thought patterns that are used in professional, academic, and journalistic English.
Another tip is to categorize vocabulary by theme, because terms related to economics, diplomacy, sanctions, energy resources, and political systems often appear together, and organizing words in thematic clusters allows learners to recognize patterns, make connections between ideas, and recall terms more efficiently when they encounter similar topics in the future, which ultimately enhances comprehension during long listening sessions and supports active use of language in discussions or written exercises about world affairs, global influence, and international cooperation.
Learners should also practice predicting what comes next in a sentence or segment, because professional English often builds on logic, with one idea leading naturally to another, and by anticipating content based on connectors, context, and prior knowledge, learners train their minds to follow extended explanations without losing track, improving listening stamina and comprehension, and making it easier to understand complex information while staying engaged throughout long podcasts, documentaries, or news broadcasts.
It is also helpful to reflect after listening, asking questions such as, which new words did I learn today? Which sentence patterns did I notice? How were ideas connected? What cause and effect relationships were explained? This reflection consolidates learning, increases retention, and provides an opportunity to practice forming your own sentences using new vocabulary and structures, reinforcing both comprehension and productive skills, while also demonstrating that long educational English podcasts are not just passive listening exercises, but active tools for language development that combine knowledge acquisition with skill building.
Finally, learners should maintain patience and consistency because language mastery is a long-term process, and improvement comes from repeated exposure, careful listening, reflection, and practice over time rather than from short, fragmented efforts. And by combining these strategies, active note-taking, summarization, shadowing, thematic organization, prediction, and reflection, learners gradually develop the ability to understand professional English in long, complex explanations, build vocabulary naturally, and improve comprehension, confidence, and overall fluency in a structured, calm, and measurable way.
In summary, by applying practical tips while listening to educational content about international events, learners can transform exposure to long-form news and analysis into concrete language learning progress, because every sentence, every connector, and every abstract concept offers an opportunity to expand vocabulary, strengthen comprehension, and develop skills that are essential for following professional and academic English, making real-world topics not only informative but also directly beneficial for English learning and long-term mastery.
So, dear learners, remember that every podcast, every careful listening session, and every reflective practice is a step forward. Because by combining attention, patience, and strategy with consistent engagement, you will improve your ability to follow complex discussions, use advanced vocabulary confidently, and understand long descriptive sentences, which ultimately allows you to connect global knowledge with English proficiency, ensuring that your learning journey is steady, meaningful, and highly effective over time.
As we reach the conclusion of today's podcast, it is valuable to pause and reflect on the wide range of topics we have explored, because understanding international affairs, political systems, energy resources, and global influence is not only important for general knowledge, but it also provides English learners with a rich opportunity to encounter advanced vocabulary, complex sentence structures, formal connectors, and explanatory language, all of which are useful for improving comprehension, long-form listening stamina, and the ability to follow multi-layered ideas in real-world English content.
For learners, reflecting on this process is just as important as listening carefully, because repetition and conscious awareness of new words, phrases, and sentence patterns help consolidate learning. And when you notice how words like diplomacy, influence, cooperation, stability, sanctions, investment, and negotiation were used in calm, factual sentences, you begin to internalize not only the meanings, but also the rhythm and flow of professional English that is commonly used in international news, academic discussions, and long-form educational podcasts.
Throughout this series, we have seen that learning English is not only about memorizing vocabulary or grammar rules, but about understanding how ideas are logically connected, how cause and effect relationships are explained, and how abstract concepts like power, influence, and stability can be communicated clearly and effectively, because by paying attention to structured explanations, long descriptive sentences, and formal connectors such as therefore, as a result, consequently, and because of this, learners gain skills that are directly transferable to comprehension in documentaries, podcasts, and academic lectures.
It is also important to remember, learners, that improvement in English listening and comprehension requires patience, because long sentences and complex explanations can feel challenging at first. But when you maintain focus and allow your brain to process the information gradually, you will notice that comprehension improves steadily. Your vocabulary becomes more natural, and your ability to follow extended narratives in formal English grows, which demonstrates that consistent practice is far more effective than rushing through content or expecting immediate mastery.
Reviewing key vocabulary from this podcast can also reinforce learning, because terms related to international relations, such as diplomacy, negotiation, sanctions, cooperation, global events, influence, and economic tools, were presented in neutral, descriptive contexts, and revisiting these words and noticing how they were applied in explanations helps learners understand both meaning and usage, while also providing models for forming their own sentences in English that are logically structured and clear.
Another valuable skill that listeners develop through long-form podcasts like this one is the ability to follow multi-layered sentences and identify connections between ideas. Because phrases that explain sequence, cause, and effect, or that show relationships between concepts, allow learners to anticipate meaning, connect new vocabulary to prior knowledge, and process large amounts of information in a calm and organized manner, which is essential for comprehension of professional and academic English.
Additionally, we have emphasized throughout this podcast that global awareness and English learning complement each other, because following international events not only introduces learners to advanced language, formal expressions, and logical reasoning, but also helps contextualize abstract concepts such as political systems, energy resources, and international influence in ways that are understandable and relatable to learners, allowing English study to feel relevant, practical, and connected to the real world.
For learners, this reflection should inspire confidence, because it shows that listening attentively to structured explanations and practicing with long-form English materials is a process that builds both comprehension and patience over time. And by focusing on understanding, repetition, and integration of new vocabulary, listeners strengthen their skills in a way that prepares them to tackle increasingly complex English content without feeling anxious or rushed.
It is also helpful to note that every section of this podcast has demonstrated the use of long descriptive sentences, abstract nouns, formal verbs, and clear connectors, and by paying close attention to sentence rhythm, pacing, and logical sequencing, learners not only improve their vocabulary, but also learn to anticipate how English speakers present information professionally, which ultimately increases listening confidence, comprehension, and the ability to produce similar structured language in speaking or writing.
Finally, learners should remember that consistency and reflection are key, because even if one does not understand every single word initially, repeated exposure, patient listening, and conscious review of vocabulary and sentence structures will gradually enhance understanding, making long-form English content more accessible, and demonstrating that progress in listening and comprehension comes from steady, thoughtful engagement rather than speed, which encourages a calm, motivated, and disciplined approach to language learning.
In summary, by carefully listening to explanations about Venezuela, global energy, political systems, diplomacy, influence, sanctions, and how international events affect ordinary people, learners gain the dual benefit of expanding their knowledge of the world and simultaneously strengthening their ability to process and understand formal English. And when these elements are combined with patience, reflection, and consistent practice, the result is meaningful, long-term improvement in both vocabulary, comprehension, and confidence in using English to follow serious educational topics.
And for learners, we want to leave you with the encouragement that every moment spent listening, reflecting, and reviewing structured, long-form English is a step forward in your journey. Because language learning is a marathon rather than a sprint, and by practicing with calm focus, building vocabulary gradually, and observing sentence patterns carefully, you develop not only comprehension skills, but also the patience, confidence, and resilience needed to continue improving in English for many years to come.
So as we close today's podcast, remember that learning English through serious educational content is a process that combines exposure to advanced vocabulary, practice with long sentences, understanding of abstract ideas, and careful reflection on cause and effect relationships. and by integrating these skills into your daily study habits, you can steadily enhance your ability to follow complex discussions, participate in global conversations, and comprehend professional English materials with clarity and confidence.
And finally, dear learners, we want to remind you that your efforts are valuable, your patience is essential, and your dedication to listening, learning, and reflecting will always lead to improvement. Because language mastery is achieved one careful step at a time. And by embracing long-form, structured English content, you are preparing yourself to understand the world more deeply, while simultaneously growing as a confident and capable English speaker who can process complex ideas calmly, accurately, and efficiently.